Narativ is funded by viewers like you. Support our independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. I'm really intrigued by Berlusconi because the parallels between Berlusconi and Trump are just phenomenal. I mean, they're not even just parallels; they're just deep connections between these two people. You know, jog our memory a little bit about who Silvio Berlusconi is.
So he gets dismissed as a bit of a clown, which is wrong because he put the template down that Trump actually follows. He was a real billionaire, owner of TV networks, owner of TV advertising conglomerates. So he had more control than anyone since Mussolini of public opinion. He was a business tycoon. And he came in right after the Cold War, and he normalized the far right. He actually brought the former neo-fascists into the government. And he established, so this was one thing he did that Trump would do. Then he was hugely corrupt. He was under investigation when he came in. He was in briefly in 1994, and then he was in 2 terms in the early 2000s. And he didn't destroy democracy, but he wrapped the law around his personal needs. So, for example, when he was accused of bribery, he had Parliament pass a law that made bribery a lesser offense. And there's a whole category of these laws called ad personam laws, meaning about the person. So he did a huge amount of damage with his corruption, and he also had ties to organized crime. During his
what a surprise!
His right-hand man, Marcello Dell'Utri, was actually convicted of Mafia association in 2004 during Berlusconi's first term of the 21st century.
I want everyone to understand that doesn't happen. So if you actually were connected to the leader of the nation at the time and brought under those kinds of organized crime charges, that means the evidence was overwhelming, and you're not a little player. There's a syndicate that he was a part of that there was no escaping this. I mean, it's that it's so corrupt what this guy, and he's so mobbed up. He's such a mobster himself that they had to charge him. That doesn't happen in Italy. So that should be like one of those things that's just a blaring red flag of that Berlusconi himself is also a member of a crime syndicate.
It's a Sicilian crime family, right?
This guy was Sicilian, and he was the entree, the liaison. And in Italian law, though, there's 3 levels that you have to pass to get really convicted, to make the conviction stick.
That's right.
So the Supreme Court didn't do it until 2014, which meant that Dell'Utri was like around being the mobster from 2004 to 2014. And then he tried to flee, but by then Berlusconi was out of office. So that part of the Trump template was also set. And plus, Berlusconi was a superb propagandist. He understood, he was a TV guy. He was not, one of his failings is he was a generation. Yeah, but he was a master, and he had endless rhetoric about witch hunts, about plots against him, about prosecutors and journalists who were out to get him. So he was the victim. He was the aggressor, and he was the victim. So he used to call himself the Jesus Christ of Italian politics.
Amazing.
You know, the whole Trump template.
The ties between the Sicilian mob and Trump as well. I mean, there's direct ties, LB, aren't there, between the Sicilian mob and Donald Trump's, and especially Fred Trump.
The crime family behind Fred Trump and the Trump organization, and eventually Donald Trump, the origins of that crime family are the same crime family that was actually involved with Mussolini's family.
Wow.
And so it's
going back all the way then.
Not that all the way back. It's not that long ago. I know to me, 100 years isn't that long ago, and it wasn't even that. So, we're just talking about a couple generations really, that were removed from these guys. And and it's a familial structure, so that when it gets mixed in with politics at that level, it matters to say it was a generational thing, because it's not going to change.
I'm going to ask Ruth to talk a little bit more about the relationship between Putin and Berlusconi, because like the relationship with Trump and Putin, these guys are close. I mean, they're really close, really close.
So I start the book with this crazy scene where the night that Obama was in 2008, people were waiting to see if, what would happen. Obama would be elected. Berlusconi was with an escort. He was married, of course, but he was always with escorts. And they were wiretapping him because of his corruption. And so there's dialogue that's captured I used to start the book where the woman says, oh, let's go have showers and wait for me on Putin's bed. And she said, oh, Putin's bed, the one with the curtains, because Putin had given Berlusconi a bed. And they were very, very close. And he was,
of all things. That's the gift.
And then later, exactly. And
probably
later,
cameras in that bed.
Probably.
Berlusconi gave Putin a duvet with their faces silk screened on it, so they could sleep. I know the whole thing. So talking about the male bonds, but that's a very important precedent for Trump. There's some big differences, but so they were authentic friends, and Putin looked up to Berlusconi in a way, and Berlusconi also didn't have the financial needs that Trump has. He wasn't in debt. However, they personalized Russia-Italy foreign policy to the point where the foreign ministry and all diplomats were kept in the dark. And Berlusconi and his bagman, Valentino Valentini, who spoke fluent Russian, they took over a foreign policy toward Russia themselves because they had all these deals going.
Wow.
And so, yes, this was a
smells like Jared Kushner.
Yes. So this privatization of foreign policy, because of the bonds of these male leaders, is one kind of strongman principle. And so many things about Berlusconi and the relationship with Putin recur, although Berlusconi he became a client of Putin more overtly when Putin became more extreme. And by then, Berlusconi was caught. He was having to take more and more extreme positions because, like on Ukraine, Crimea, etc. But there were many things that were the same in terms of the end of accountability in foreign affairs and the need for secrecy.
More on that coming up, but I did want to raise this interesting clip. It's going back to Putin's bed and their sort of sexual adventures. I don't know what they were doing together, the Bunga parties or whatever they were called. There is Anderson Cooper talking to the reporter in Italy on the day that Berlusconi was first sentenced, I think, to 7 years. And he describes what these women were doing at the Bunga parties. And, it's eerily reminiscent of something else. So let's take a listen.
This all began at one of those infamous Bunga parties that Berlusconi used to throw, right?
That's correct. And Mr. Berlusconi always insisted that these were elegant parties in good taste, but certainly the details that have come out during this trial point to something quite the opposite. They point to basically call girls being hired to perform at these after-dinner parties in the so-called Bunga room, where some of them, for instance, dressed up as Obama and engaged in sort of semi-erotic fondling of one another for the pleasure of the guests.
So, I mean, when have we heard that before? We've heard that about Donald Trump, having these sort of sexual fantasies around Obama. And here's Berlusconi doing the same thing. Yeah.
And the Bunga name was given by his great friend Gaddafi. And they used to party together as well. And one point I want to make is that these guys are like hoarders in a way. They have a kind of maniacal need for our attention 24/7, for our money, for national resources to be plundered like Putin does and Mobutu did, and for bodies. And so several of them have sex addictions. And I write about those. I write about the Bunga parties. I write about Gaddafi keeping sexual slaves. And it's not for sensationalism. It's because it's like as though Jeffrey Epstein were the head of the government and he hijacked secret police and all of the state resources to fill his private obsession. Because these guys need pipelines of bodies, just like they need. I make an analogy between just as they capture the nation's resources and the wealth, they also need bodies. And the difference is that Trump had this set up with the same as Berlusconi, the beauty queens, the models. And, he had to close it down when he came into office. But Berlusconi was doing it, and the others of the 20th century were doing it when they were in office.
Like vampires.
Yeah.
Vampires.
Yeah. Yes. I think, for example, Putin is a vampire. They suck the life out of the nation. And at its most extreme, when you have kleptocracies, they are like a vampire-like figures.
They are. I see three things with these guys and the underworld that they come out of, because that's what they're coming out of. You see, there's always arms dealing. It's going on, right? You've got some major arms deals in there. You see the looting of national resources. As soon as they get in, it's the Gazproms, it's the oil in Libya, it's whatever it is. It's just looting from the people for themselves that then gets pushed through their criminal syndicate. And you see banks. You see banks. These guys they all have banks either at their disposal that are state banks or banks that are someone else's state bank that help to put them into power in some way.
I want to play another clip. This is Berlusconi in 2017, thinking about a comeback, believe it or not. And he's thinking about a comeback right now, and he's still involved in politics as we speak. But in 2017, he sat down with Shane Smith of Vice News. And it really tells you a lot about Vice News and who they really might be representing. But it's a really interesting tell-all about Berlusconi's life. And he talks about what he did with Putin and George Bush and how he brought them together. And then he talks a lot about the relationship between Putin and Trump. Really fascinating clip. So let's take a listen to it, and then we'll talk on the other side.
Ici, j'ai swimming pool, jacuzzi, sauna, vapeur.
C'est quoi cette photo?
Cette photo, c'est Ensemble pour la paix.
Putin, Bush, et toi?
Mai j'étais l'ospite.
And what do you think of Putin and what do you think of Trump?
Io penso dobbiamo fare di tutto per riportare la Russia nell'Occidente. Vladimir Putin è un leader eccezionale. Io sono legato da un'amicizia fraterna a lui. Quando io e Putin siamo scesi nelle vie della Crimea, siamo stati circondati dai cittadini della Crimea che lo baciavano, le signore anziane che piangevano. Grazie Vladimir, siamo ritornati a casa. Mr. Trump non lo conosco, non l'ho mai incontrato. Credo di sapere perché gli americani l'hanno scelto. Donald Trump è entrato per molti anni come star della televisione nelle case degli americani e è diventato qualcuno a cui si dà del tu. Come gli italiani mi chiamano Silvio, lui lo chiamano Donald. Io desidero che Mr. Trump e Mr. Putin possano incontrarsi, capirsi e diventare amici tra di loro, come io ero riuscito a far diventare amici Mr. George Bush e Mr. Putin.
So, I mean, so many interesting things there, but there he is doing Putin's work, really. And they really are cut from the same cloth. I mean, there's nothing to distinguish them. And then, of course, taking them to Crimea, taking Putin to Crimea is the only place he'd be popular, I think, in the world.
Anytime Putin comes out, there's an old lady crying.
Yeah.
Just so everybody understands, that's a piece of propaganda.
That whole thing was propaganda, yeah.
Putin makes sure, and then Berlusconi just described trust washing. He just basically said, "Yeah, Mark Burnett took him and made him familiar for you guys so that you would install him."
Yeah, just like me, just because everyone knows me is Silvio.
Because Putin's, he in other ways a vampire. He's needed, he's had these enablers who have worked for him to get what he wants in the West, and he had Gerhard Schroeder very early on, and then Bush was supposed to be the next one. So Berlusconi was the one, pressing for him to get in the G7, and then Berlusconi didn't last in power, and so I recount in the book. Then he found Trump, which was the big prize.
Now he has neither. So we'll see what happens.
Neither.
Now, it does, you can't separate them. You've got the mob, you've got Russian intelligence, you've got Russia, the Kremlin involved in this takeover of countries. I mean, there's a common thread here. And it's not just happening to America. It's happened at least to other democracies in the world. And it all seems to go back to Putin.
Yeah. Yeah, between that, what he's doing there, and the increasing effectiveness of his propaganda abroad through RT. RT is being normalized more and more. My mother, unfortunately, she's almost 90 and she lives in England, and she's become radicalized since the pandemic because she watches RT.
Oh, wow.
She used to watch Sky News because she's always been on the right, so BBC was like way too leftist. But she was a conservative, and now she's radicalized because she watches RT, and she's worried about white extinction, and she won't take the vaccine, and it's a nightmare. And RT has made great inroads. So this is part of his, plan to arrange things so that he can have his hegemony and take down the U.S.
He's announced increased spending for RT, and then today I think he passed a bill saying that former presidents are immune from prosecution in Russia. So everything he's done doesn't have to pay for in any way later on, which is fascinating in itself because, of course, there's so much crime that comes out of Russia and out of the mob in Russia, and here it is infecting our world. When I looked at I went through your book and I kept writing notes about these different things that you need to be an autocrat, this modern day strongman. You need the media, of course. You need the new media, specifically in Trump's case. He loves Twitter, but whatever the prevailing new media of the era is, they seem to use that. And then the traditional media, sort of the state media, which is often run by friends or sympathizers of the autocrat, and is used for propaganda. Talk to me a little bit about the media play and how important propaganda is in setting up these autocrats.
Yeah, what's really interesting, so every chapter, the core of the book are these chapters on these tools, right? The corruption, the violence, the propaganda. And each one goes over 100 years, which made it challenging to write. There were many times where I thought, why didn't I just do the easy thing and have biographies, But
it's really interesting. You did a great job. I really enjoyed the way you did it.
It was really hard, but
it really is. Yeah.
Because the idea, I wanted people to see what changes and what stays the same. So, for example, propaganda, it's repetition and saturation of the national or whatever marketplace. So we have that with, from Mussolini to the slogans and all of these men who have success. It's really interesting. Many of them come to office with some background in communications, so they're very good sloganeers. So Mussolini was a journalist. Mobutu had been a journalist.
Interesting.
And Hitler had been a journalist, and then he took hypnosis lessons. Hitler took voice lessons, hypnosis lessons. Yeah. And so they know how to make slogans. They know how to connect authentically, up to Modi, who uses Instagram. So that's very important. But one thing that's changed is, so before, Mussolini passed a law or an edict that said that in 1939, you couldn't have headlines with question marks because, it was all about Mussolini is always right, and you had to lock down meaning. But the newer playbook of the 21st century, which comes from Putin, is that you throw question marks up about everything, and you use conspiracy theory and confusion so that it's not clear what the truth is. So although there are continuities in saturating with messages and repetition, and also censorship, of course, sometimes deadly, right? Putin kills journalists saying the wrong thing. But there's also this new, the 21st century playbook of confusing people.
And the fake news strategy, which seems to be omnipresent. News. Yeah, which is, they start off really quickly at the beginning of every strongman presidency or leadership. They say, they immediately alienate the media as being the enemy of the people and immediately declare them fake news to prepare the nation, I guess, for what's coming.
Right.
That's really important. In fact, what Trump has done, and this is a way you can see who, if you're looking at somebody on the rise, you say, are they going to be a strongman? One of the things you look for is them demonizing journalists on their way into power, right? Because now you have to run for office. And one of the things Trump has done is that he not only had traditional American enemies, like African Americans of the right, obviously, migrants, people of color in general, but he added new political enemies. He made the press into an authentic political enemy, even using the authoritarian slogan, "They're enemies of the state." And the reason they do this early on, though, is because they're corrupt. Because when they get into office, and then their secrets are going to be revealed by the media, they need their followers to already think that these media are biased and to already hate them. So that's part of the playbook, and we saw Trump doing that from the very start.
And we saw Trump admitting that's why he was doing that. He was asked that by Leslie Stahl point blank, and he said, so that when you say things about me, they won't believe him. Now, what I want to do, just in terms, I want to ask you this, in terms of how you wove this all together, and you saw that there is a playbook. There's a strongman playbook. It's there are very specific things, especially in that toolbox, and very specific ways to write about stuff. Considering who we know Donald to be, what I get frustrated with, and I just want to ask your opinion on this and your take on this. I get frustrated with our media's constant framing of him, that he's just sort of stumbling into his fascism. Yeah. He's just sort of stumbling into his strongman thing. It's just like it's a natural thing for him. Whereas when I look at it, knowing what I know, I'm like, he's trained. He's crafting this shit.
Oh, yeah.
He knows what he's doing. And so I always come back to who trained him. I don't think he just sat there and did his homework. The guy doesn't read. So who trained him to do this with the press, do this with that, do this over here, make sure you say this, we're going to do this with the migrants, here's the plan, here's the roadmap. It just seems to me that there's, and I'm trying to be careful with it because it's Zev's program and I don't want to say something. But,
go right ahead. Everything you say.
Look, he was trained. He's a trained propagandist. He's trained in all these techniques. Yes. He's been giving them, he could even be just taking instructions regularly so that he can keep following it. But there's no way that this guy himself just went into some deep dive early on in his life and did the kind of research that you did to put this book together to know what he had to do. No, somebody trained him.
There's a couple of parts to the answer. One is that he's been surrounded his whole life by master manipulators of information, from Roy Cohn to Roger Stone.
That's right.
And I didn't know this. Probably a lot of people knew it, but I didn't. That Roger Stone and Paul Manafort had a lobbying firm, and they worked for dictators. They worked for Mobutu, and I already had Mobutu in the book.
That's right.
It was like one of these, because I already had Mobutu in the book, and then I discovered that Stone and Manafort had worked for Mobutu, and they worked for Ferdinand Marcos. And they were, this is unbelievable. They were hired in 1985. I found the Foreign Agent Act that they signed explicitly to run this fraudulent snap election. And so, so here we have propagandists who have worked for dictators. We have people specialized in election fraud. And then, of course, we know Manafort worked for Putin and all the rest. But there's also, I think that Trump learned a lot, like Berlusconi did, from his success in marketing and his success in entertainment, because that's part of it. Knowing how to seduce the crowd, the rallies, all the things we talked about already. That's learned from experience. And the White House photographer, I'm forgetting his name, but he has photographed everybody from Reagan onward.
Pete D'Souza, I think.
Yes, he said that he photographed Trump, and he said that no other person, not even Reagan, was so attentive to every tiny detail of his image except for Trump. Even like the millimeter of his cuff. And so Trump is a highly trained visual animal. He's a highly trained propagandist. And he surrounded himself, and then let's not leave out Steve Bannon, who is a far-right propagandist, professional propagandist, who's made films, he's dedicated his life to overturning democracy. So just those people alone, and then there are the junior quite extremists like Miller, who's young though. So if we just leave him out, but these are men he's surrounded by men who have decades of experience in undermining democracy.
Let me add some more
really
names
scary.
to that, at least some really interesting coincidences or not. So this is all out of your book. Berlusconi and Trump both have Putin in common.
I love these two orange guys.
Yeah. They both have Deutsche
Orange as
Bank.
it gets.
They both have Deutsche
The two
Bank.
orange-
The orange
They
man.
do.
They're very tanned, very well tanned. They have Deutsche
Orange
Bank in common.
Mussolini's.
They have Libyan oil in common. There's a whole thread around Libyan oil that they have in common. They have the Sicilian mob, as we've discussed, in common. And they also have Rupert Murdoch in common, which is an interesting thing. And Murdoch is more of an opponent to Berlusconi originally in Italian politics. But at the end, they became allies. So, well, not allies, more business partners. And so you've got a lot of the same framework building these two dictators.
We haven't even begun. LB, when you're saying people don't like to hear this, people can't even digest half of what is going on. Will they?
Crazy.
It does.
It makes us all crazy. Just so everybody is like, we can't get ahead of how we share, what we share.
It's too threatening, and that's also why one of the things that's so sad is that time and again people don't want to see what's in front of them. And they have these cherished national myths, like it can't happen here, or it's less threatening to think of Trump as incompetent, as just getting lucky at this or that, and just wanting to golf. And I must have said a million times that the golf, like he had no interest in being a president by normal standards. The golfing is the corruption. He's spent 1 out of every 3 days golfing because he's turned the presidency into a for-profit, private profit enterprise. It's not that he's lazy. He's actually worked extremely hard at the things he cares about. The tweeting, like over 100 tweets a day. He's working hard. It's just that the goals have nothing to do with public welfare. And also when you say things, which I've done since March, people kind of recoil, like that he really doesn't care if you live or die. And this is also connected, because he's connected to organized crime, and that's how they think. It's a very bleak way of looking at the world.
Absolutely, but he doesn't.
It's like too much for people to digest.
And they don't really look at the people behind him. They can look. They think the buck stops at Trump, but when Trump goes, actually the machine's still there. It's not going to stop doing what it's done, and will continue to do it. One of those people that I find so fascinating, and it's only because of Opus Dei that I'm bringing him up, is Bill Barr's role, because Bill Barr has a tie into Opus Dei, and Opus Dei has a tie into Berlusconi. So
that's right.
So tell us a little bit about that really fascinating triangulation.
So one of the things that comes that I learned a lot myself doing this book, going over 100 years, is you get these little through lines, and I couldn't develop all of them in the space I had, but one of them is Opus Dei. So, which is a very extreme Catholic sect with a lot of power. And they first came into the dictator world in a serious way with Francisco Franco. And by the way, we know that Nazis went to Paraguay and all these other places in South and Latin America, but they also, a lot of neo-Nazis and neo-fascists went to Franco's Spain, and they got refuge there. So Opus Dei took care of Franco's economic policy. And then that gets continued in Chile under Pinochet. Opus Dei, again, is very, very important behind the scenes doing the neoliberal and other kinds of economic policy. So then I start researching Trump, and I find that a number of figures, from Pat Cipollone to Bill Barr to Larry Kudlow, who was Jewish but was converted by a priest who's part of the Catholic Information Center that's affiliated with Opus Dei. There's a large number of people at the very top of the inner circle of Trump who are affiliated with Opus Dei. So we don't hear about that. We hear more about the evangelicals, but the Opus Dei is highly secretive, and it's connected to Vatican corruption and all kinds of financial corruption. So it was like every through line from the authoritarian past comes home to roost in the Trump White House.
LB's got a lot on Opus Dei as well.
Oh, yeah.
Well, let me just ask you, Ruth, did you find any spies in the Opus Dei? Were there any spies in there?
You probably know much more than I do.
And this is one of those things that, is, again, you don't want to get ahead of people because then they think it's too much, right? It's like, it's too much. But the sort of average American's understanding of the way that the world works from the underworld up is just very naive and very movie, it's like a movie. They'll buy the movie version or they'll buy the novel version. But when you get into it and you start really thinking about it, it's hard for Americans to make that connection. Just as hard as it is for them to think, oh my God, we might have a president who doesn't care if people live or die because he doesn't have that same, because there's real evil going on here. It's too much for them. But I just asked people, so I'll just throw this out for the audience. I talked to Zev a little bit about this ahead of time. Sorry, my nose is so itchy. But you have to understand when it comes to the Vatican that this is, everyone, just think of it historically, everybody, of what is that? What did the Vatican, how much power has it had? How ancient is it? What kind of geopolitics has it been at the heart of? And how long has it been at the heart of geopolitics? How has it shaped world power from centuries ago? It's a force, right? It's a force. It has its own banks. What's in those banks? We don't know. It's the most secret. These are the most secretive banks in the world, right? We do know that there's organized crime money in there. We do have assassinations along the way, just even in the last 100 years that are, and even from the 80s on, that are big assassinations associated with the Vatican Bank, associated with all this. And it also, the Vatican, the Catholic Church from the Pope down, is the largest sort of the wealth of their real estate holdings all over the planet. So look at it like that. Look at it like
their reach.
Geopolitical force. Look at their reach. Look at their wealth. Look at how ancient they've been. And then ask yourself, would a force like that not have an intelligence agency? Does it make any sense that they would not have an intelligence agency, that they would not have secrets that they have buried deep in there, that they wouldn't have their hands in other nation states in ways that allow them to have levers and controls? Does that make any sense to anybody, that wouldn't exist? And then take a look at people like Bill Barr, an intelligence agent, Opus Dei, Robert Hansen, right? A big spy for the KGB, Opus Dei, whose brother-in-law, Opus Dei, wrote Bill Barr's speeches. Just start looking at it like that, because people want to go, oh, Opus Dei, it's a crazy dominionist religious sect. Instead of thinking of it, yes, there are people who follow that discipline. There are people who are Opus Dei that are followers that practice that. But we're talking about operatives here. We're talking about people who actually were intelligence agents and they all end up being Opus Dei, or people who were attorneys deep in there, Opus Dei, Supreme Court justices, Opus Dei. Look at it that way and start really thinking about what is this fucking organization? What's going on here? Sorry to swear, Ruth. I don't want to swear.
It's okay. It's okay.
No, but Marcello Dell'Utri, the senator and right-hand man of Berlusconi, who we talked about, was convicted of Mafia association. He was from Palermo. He wasn't only Berlusconi's link to the Mafia, but he was affiliated with Opus Dei as well.
In 1982, I think there was Pope John Paul II, who actually made the Opus Dei directly report to him. And it's one of the few sects or whatever it is of the Catholic religion which reports directly to the Pope. And there's probably a good reason for that, because he probably wants direct knowledge and control. When you pull back from all of this, you've got these autocrats. Sure, they exist. As LB, let's go full circle to the beginning, mentioned at the beginning, it's there's people enabling them. There's an establishment enabling them, whether it's, whether it's the churches, whether it's the media institutions, whether it's the royalties of the period or the monarchs or the older families or the organized crime families. There is a force of elite people seem to be behind all these autocrats. They may not identify with them, but when you look back, they all seem to have those backings. I think of the Koch brothers and the Koch family, which supported Stalin, Hitler, and Trump. I mean, you got families like that have done this for generations. So these guys are not just strong men on their own. They didn't just stand up and become strong. They been made strong by their enablers. And we tend to stop just at the lines of who these individuals are. We don't go and look beyond them. And that's really where all the action is.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to, even though the book has these protagonists, and I do talk about their, personal traits, because when you have when you exercise this kind of power, your personality, as we see with Trump, sets many agendas. But doing the tools, for example, let's keep to corruption, it allows you to highlight these enablers. And I think I have a sentence in the book, he's nothing without his enablers. From the very start, it's the political and financial elites who are so important at the start, but they continue on. And everything that these guys do is also to reward these enablers. So one of the things, like, people don't know about Mussolini, they think, like today there's this crazy right-wing talking point that says that fascism was left. So they can blame all the violence on the left, when of course the left was the earliest target of fascism. But nobody knows that Mussolini, was backed by the big financial and business elites. And one of the first things he did when he became a prime minister, so he's also really relevant because he was prime minister for 3 years in a democracy. And during that time, that's when he established the template. But the first thing he did in 1923 was to privatize major industries like equivalent of telecommunications, insurance, like big sectors were privatized. And this was his gift to the elites.
It's like $1 trillion tax cut,
Yeah. So, and even with Trump, of course, who has he really, allied with? He has this faux populism, drain the swamps and all that, but he's privileged big agriculture, big pharma, big, logging, mining. And it's really sad if you look at, he's rolled back over 100 environmental regulations and health, food sanitation, all to please the big capitalist interests.
A tax cut, right? This sort of tax scam, right? The largest transfer of wealth from the middle income and the poor to the wealthy elite in frickin' history. That was the largest transfer of wealth in history.
And it's so interesting. It's a really insane amount of money when you think about the situation we're all in right now. You mentioned Mussolini was prime minister for 3 years, and then he became what was the title? I don't know. Duce, was that the right thing?
Duce.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
that's the leader, right? Il Duce is the leader. Yeah.
And so that transition, and we're staring at, people are concerned as they look at the January 6th date, at the Republicans in the House and in the Senate trying to overturn this vote, and yet another stir about whether there's going to be some sort of coup attempt or martial law or God knows what Trump might do. As you look back at all these strong men and you look at their playbook, does that playbook help you identify what might happen?
Oh, totally.
How does it end for them? Give us the Christmas cheer.
Because
they all end in a very specific way. Very specific way.
Well, one thing about Mussolini first, which is so relevant, he declared dictatorship because he was the subject of a special investigation that was going to send him to jail, because he had his socialist opponent, who was very popular, killed. And when I went to grad school, I learned that it was just about politics, that the guy was this big, he was the head of socialists, so he had to go. And this is, LB, we were talking before the show about corruption research. Well, what's come out like not that long ago is that this Matteotti, the head of the socialists, was an early anti-corruption crusader, and he was spending his nights and weekends. He had a huge book that he compiled of all the financial crimes and bribes of the fascist party, and he was about to reveal it to Parliament, and so he had to be killed. And then that set off a crisis that got Mussolini in the middle of an investigation. So the first dictatorship in 20th century was declared to get out of a corruption scandal, which is pretty relevant for today.
And so the second part of the question was, can you help predict what's going to happen? What's Donald Trump going to do? Donald Trump going to do?
So I had to turn the book in July, and I had time to fit in the Black Lives Matter protests and the Lafayette Square. So I didn't know how the election would go, but what I was able to say is that there was no way he was going to go quietly, and that he had every incentive to try and remain in power, and that they will do anything to stay in power. Nothing is off the table. And I actually I'm not surprised at what's going on now with the coup stuff, because what went on in the summer, where, with Tom Cotton bringing the troops, this was a test, because this is what these guys do. They test continuously. And this was a rehearsal for the election and this transition period to see how much support he would have to have some kind of military action. And that's why it was psychological warfare, where they flooded, DC with all these unmarked troops and all of that business. But this was like as many people pointed out, was like a little bit of a weird coup-ish environment, ambiance going on.
How much can you test it? Let's just test it, push on democracy. See, does it matter if we grab people off the street and throw them into unmarked vans?
Right.
Yeah.
So there was it was a lot lot of that.
When people say institutions of
yeah.
Yes, totally Putin-esque and Pinochet-esque. But when people say, we in fact, what we did, knowing all we know about Trump and company, it's incredible that the election voted him out, because people had to vote in really difficult circumstances with the voter suppression and the pandemic. But we did it, and it's very rare that a country has the chance to interrupt a process of authoritarian capture by a criminal and get rid of him.
That's a great line. Authoritarian capture by a criminal. We interrupted it.
We interrupted it. I didn't realize that was such a rare thing, actually. I would have thought that there might have been other instances of that. That is good to know. Helpful.
It's unusual, so we have to feel really, really good about that. And I don't think the regular military is going to go for his thing, but as you know, he's got these kind of paramilitary, and he's turned ICE and Homeland Security into this kind of paramilitary and this militias. I think that in the end he'll have to go, but he's going to try and make America as unstable and violent as possible, not just him, the GOP, so that the conditions are there for something, just as bad or worse later on.
And even though people like Berlusconi have been voted out before, and they've also come back, and so even if he does go, people think he might just disappear into the ether. Others say he'll stick around, either as a exiled leader of the GOP, I mean exiled from Washington, but still running the GOP, or might even start a breakaway movement of some sort, or a third party, in order to return either in 24 or whenever.
Yeah, I don't really see him giving up all these souls he's captured, because they need, psychologically, he needs these crowds. And he also needs to keep the GOP domesticated for the reasons that also LB was talking about, the male dominance. I can't see him just giving that up. That's not how these guys work.
Yeah.
What he'll do, I'm not sure, but he's not going to give up his investment.
And it's not just his; it's also Russia, which has hacked our institutions now, and these other enablers that. So we're still not over it yet, even though it does seem like we've performed a bit of a miracle by electing Joe Biden. thank you so much, Ruth Bin-Ghiat. Thanks for joining us on the show today. What a great conversation. The book is called Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. There's the cover. It's really a good read.
It's really good. You guys just got to hear how Ruth speaks, her language. You're so unique. And your ability to weave these stories together, weave these men together in a way, I found it to be searing and quite wonderful. And it's going to be a good listen, guys. So you can get this. Tell everybody where they can get the book, and that honestly, just get the audiobook. It's great. I do highly recommend it. It's not really, it was such a privilege to read your writing. It really was.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for having me. It was a great conversation. It's nice to be able to speak frankly to people who understand at a very high level what's going on, and in some areas far more than I do. And that's great. You can get the book any independent bookstore, Amazon. The audio book is out. I hope you'll read it.
Thank you, Ruth. Thanks so much. And it really does place all of what we're going through in an historical context, which is, we forget we're part of history. There's a lot of going on here. There are forces at play, and you got to understand those forces in order to defeat them. And that's why we're doing what we do on the show. And that's why this book is so important. So please go out and read it. And thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ruth. Bye, LB.
Bye.
Merry Christmas.
Narativ is funded by viewers like you. Support our independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative.